Welcome to the debate. Have you ever tried to learn how to paint, but every single brush stroke you make, every clumsy smudge, every mismatched color is instantly framed, hung in a global gallery, and critiqued by millions of strangers? Forever?
Oh, and it's not just that they critique it in the moment, right? That gallery has a perfect memory. It never, ever throws anything away.
Exactly.
Years later, just as you're unveiling your masterpiece, someone pulls that clumsy first sketch out of the basement just to remind everyone of your mistakes.
Yeah, it is the ultimate digital panopticon. And honestly, it raises a crucial question for anyone making anything today. Is the ultimate creative superpower the freedom to fail in complete obscurity? Or does true innovation actually require the brutal friction of a public audience?
It's a dark question.
No audience it's the only environment where authentic creativity can grow, completely unburdened by external expectations.
Well, while I understand the romantic appeal of the solitary genius, I argue the exact opposite. A private period of incubation has its place, sure, but ultimately it is the crucible of public visibility, collaboration, and external accountability that actually refines raw, fragile ideas into transformative innovations.
Let's just start with the fundamental psychological reality of creating in public today. When a creator has a massive following, whether they are like an artist, a writer, or a startup founder, they inevitably become a slave to their brand.
A slave? That's a strong word.
But it's true. Audience expectations act like a kind of digital gravity. The larger your audience gets, the harder it is to reach escape velocity and try something completely new. You become bound by algorithmic expectations.
But isn't that just market feedback? I mean, if the crowd is rejecting a change in direction, maybe the new direction just isn't very good.
No, it's not just about the quality of the work. It's about the psychological state of the creator. When you have an audience of 1 million people, you are managing 1 million different projections of who you should be. But when you have one view, when you have virtually no audience, you become the god of your own world.
Right, but having one view usually just feels like you're a digital ghost. It's totally demotivating for most people.
Sure, it feels like that if you're chasing the algorithm. But being forgotten by the algorithm is actually a massive gift. Carl Jung framed this beautifully in his theories of analytical psychology. He argued that looking outward makes us sleep, right? We conform to the external world, but looking inward is the only way to awake.
So you're saying total isolation is the only way to wake up.
I'm saying if the world isn't watching, you are finally free to be yourself. This quiet period of obscurity allows a creator to experiment, to be completely cringe, to make mistakes, and to be unapologetically themselves without any lasting consequence.
I see the appeal of that sanctuary, I really do, but complete withdrawal into your own private world carries a massive and honestly often fatal risk of stagnation. Without an audience, there is a profound lack of accountability. You say looking inward wakes us up, but I would argue that staying inward too long just leads to delusions of grandeur.
Wow. Delusions of grandeur.
Yeah, because if we look at the psychological research on social media's collaborative possibilities, we see that the public sphere does something vital. It breaks down geographical and intellectual silos. It provides a real-time feedback loop. It is precisely that crowdsourced friction, the pushback, the critique, the demand for clarity that forces a creator to push a nascent, half-baked idea into a finished masterpiece. You cannot test the structural integrity of a bridge without driving heavy trucks over it.
Okay, I like the bridge analogy, but you have to remember that those heavy trucks aren't just like objective tests of structural integrity. In our current digital ecosystem, they are a persistent, immutable digital archive. We are dealing with algorithmic memory.
Right.
Look at the psychological studies surrounding tools like tweet delete. The persistence of digital audiences creates what the literature calls a digital time bomb.
A time bomb in what sense exactly?
In the sense that every thought, every pivot, every failed experiment is archived, searchable, and potentially weaponized out of context years later. Creators are terrified of their own pasts. Think about the last time you drafted an email or a post or a piece of code and you deleted it just because you were terrified of how the ghost audience might perceive it 5 years from now.
Yeah, the fear of the screenshot.
Exactly. And because of this, creators soften their ambitions. They suppress their oddities to remain likable to this persistent audience. The greatest threat to a creator isn't failure. It's a successful algorithm that traps them in a past version of themselves. A creator in obscurity is like a seed growing in the dark soil. It is not stuck, it is strengthening. It needs that dark, unobserved space to establish robust roots before it can handle the harsh elements above ground.
Okay, that sounds incredibly poetic. But let's break down the mechanics of that dark soil. How do we practically distinguish between strategically avoiding a ghost audience to build strength and simply hiding from reality because we are terrified of criticism? I would argue that your dark soil can very easily become a grave without the sunlight of external engagement.
It becomes a grave if you stay there forever, sure. But as a developmental phase, it's non-negotiable.
But even in the developmental phase, you need interaction. Social platforms, for all their highly publicized flaws, provide crowdsourcing that actually nurtures creativity by merging diverse perspectives. Kevin Systrom, the co-founder of Instagram, has talked extensively about this. There is no Midas touch. You don't just sit in a dark room and birth a perfect product.
Well, sometimes.
No, you have to generate 100 ideas to find the one that works. And the only way you edit out the bad ones is by pressure testing them with other people. If you stay in the dark soil forever, you are just talking to yourself. You never find out if your idea actually solves a problem or resonates with anyone else.
But you can get that external validation without sacrificing your psychological safety. You don't have to tie those early, fragile ideas to your permanent public identity. The research on collaborative design dives deeply into the power of anonymity as a safe space. When identities are hidden, we see a massive reduction in what psychologists call social evaluation apprehension.
Meaning the fear of being judged by the tribe.
Exactly. Our brains are hardwired to fear tribal rejection because, evolutionarily speaking, rejection meant death. When you remove the permanent identity, when you operate in anonymous obscurity, you strip away the hierarchies of status, gender, and organizational power that trigger that apprehension.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
What you are left with is a pure meritocracy of concepts. Radical, disruptive, or even deeply unpopular ideas can be proposed and tested without the fear of professional backlash. This is the profound utility of obscurity. It is the freedom to detach your ego from the idea, allowing the idea to be judged solely on its own mechanical merits rather than, who proposed it.
All right, I'll grant that anonymity lowers inhibitions, which can spark raw ideation. But you are completely ignoring the darker psychological mechanisms at play when we remove identity. The literature on the online disinhibition effect shows us that this phenomenon is distinctly dual-natured. On one hand, yes, you have benign disinhibition, the vulnerability, the honesty, the pure meritocracy you're praising. But on the exact same token, anonymity invites toxic disinhibition.
Because they aren't afraid of the consequences.
Right. But how does that actually play out? Look at the behavioral data from platforms like Chat Roulette or unmoderated image boards like 4chan. Without the constraints of identity and public accountability, environments devolve rapidly. The lack of an audience holding you responsible emboldens what researchers term dark creativity.
Dark creativity?
Yeah, this is where creative problem-solving is hijacked for antisocial, devious, or purely destructive ends. Our identities and the audiences that hold those identities accountable act as a necessary social tether. The healthy boundaries imposed by a visible, accountable identity are what keep the creative process constructive. Cut the tether, and you don't just get honesty, you get chaos.
But that assumes obscurity means throwing yourself into an anonymous, chaotic internet forum. Obscurity isn't just about anonymous posting, it's about the private crucible of failure. It's about closed doors. Look at the industrial and technological sectors. The story of Slack is a perfect example of this. Slack did not start as a brilliant, highly publicized productivity app. It emerged from the ashes of a completely failed online multiplayer game called Glitch.
Right, they built an internal communication tool while the game was basically sinking.
Exactly. The game was failing, but because they were operating internally, building a communication tool just for themselves in the background, they had the psychological safety to pivot. If Glitch had been built entirely in the public eye,
with tech journalists and investors tweeting about its daily demise. The founder's biological stress responses, the cortisol, the panic, would have forced them into defensive posturing.
They would have been doing damage control.
Yes! They would have been too busy managing the PR disaster to notice the brilliant little chat tool they had built. They didn't have the world watching and mocking their failure in real time.
So the obscurity shielded them from the fallout.
It did more than shield them. It preserved their cognitive bandwidth. This maps perfectly onto Jessica Lahey's pedagogical framework in The Gift of Failure. She points out that developing a true growth mindset and intrinsic motivation requires the freedom to fail without paralyzing public shame. Overparenting, or in our context, the over-scrutinizing gaze of a massive audience, completely undermines autonomy. When a creator is allowed to fail privately, they can focus purely on the process and the mechanics of the problem, rather than managing the catastrophic social outcome of the failure.
Look, I understand why the Slack pivot is such a seductive example. It's comforting to think we can make all our mistakes in secret and only emerge when we have the billion-dollar idea. But let's counter that with the perspective of investor Danny Reimer from Index Ventures. He points out a hard truth about modern innovation. The days of low risk, high reward are a mirage. Transformative risk requires being bold in the market, not just in the comfort of your own private laboratory.
But taking a risk in the market doesn't mean you can't incubate the idea privately first.
Incubation is fine, but the actual transformative moment is public. Look at Figma. When Dylan Field was building Figma, they faced an intense period of market scrutiny and skepticism. They were trying to build a complex design tool entirely in the browser, which everyone thought was impossible. They didn't retreat into stealth mode. They didn't hide in your dark soil when the pressure mounted.
They did have a beta period, though.
But they took a massive, highly visible risk by holding an 8,500 attendee public developer conference. They put all eyes on themselves. Why? Because risking failure in the public eye is the only way to drive genuine adoption and change market perception. Failing privately is comfortable. It protects your ego. But true grit, the kind of resilience that actually shifts paradigms, is forged by risking failure when everyone is watching. When you dream big, failure is inevitable. But surviving public failure is what proves the viability of the vision to both yourself and the market.
I hear you on Figma, but you are conflating a massive corporate marketing risk with the actual genesis of the creative idea. Furthermore, public failure today carries a disproportionate, unnatural cost. If we return to the concept of algorithmic memory, a public failure isn't just a learning experience anymore. It becomes a permanent digital tattoo. When a creator or a founder fails publicly today, the internet archives it, indexes it, and serves it up in search results for the rest of their career. That isn't just friction. That is a psychological load that creates profound digital discomfort.
But shouldn't creators be resilient enough to handle their own track records? I mean, if you build something, own it.
It's not just about resilience. It's about cognitive processing. The freedom to be forgotten is almost a biological necessity that we've systematically stripped away with technology. Historically, forgetting allowed human beings to shed old versions of themselves and evolve. If we force every creator to take their risks in the public square, we're going to see a massive chilling effect on innovation. People will only propose safe, incremental ideas because the cost of a radical public failure is permanent, unerasable reputational damage.
I look at that exact same dynamic and draw the completely opposite conclusion. That is exactly why the friction of the public sphere is so valuable. It acts as an evolutionary filter.
An evolutionary filter? So just weeding people out?
Yes, it filters out the fragile ideas and the uncommitted creators. If the prospect of a digital record deters someone from taking a risk, then frankly, that risk wasn't backed by enough conviction in the first place. You mentioned earlier that an audience acts like a helicopter parent, hovering over the creator and inducing panic. I argue that a public audience is the exact opposite of a helicopter parent. It is the ultimate indifferent judge. It doesn't coddle you. It tells you exactly what works and what doesn't.
Indifference can be just as paralyzing as hyperscrutiny, though.
But it forces engagement. Let's look at the psychology of art reception. When we examine case studies of overlooked masterpieces in art history, we see that art doesn't exist in a vacuum. The concept of aesthetic incompleteness, works that are technically unfinished, only gains its profound power when it engages with the viewer. Why? Because of the Zeigarnik effect.
The brain's tendency to remember interrupted tasks.
Exactly. Our cognitive architecture demands closure. When we see an unfinished task or an incomplete narrative, it creates a psychological itch. An unfinished masterpiece lingers in the mind precisely because it requires an audience to experience that lingering. The art demands an active, vision-seeking participation from the public to complete it in their own minds. The creative act is inherently a dialogue, not a monologue. Without the audience providing that closure, the unfinished work is just a discarded sketch.
I appreciate the mechanics of the Zeigarnik effect, but let's look at why those works were left unfinished in the first place. Often, it was because the artist was deeply immersed in the internal, obscure process of creation, entirely untethered from the demands of completion that a patron or an audience would require. The works of Da Vinci or Van Gogh that defy completion offer us an intimate peek into the artist's unedited mind. They weren't performing for the algorithm of their day. They were exploring.
But we only care about those explorations because they eventually reached an audience. If they stayed in the dark soil forever, we wouldn't be talking about them.
True, but the creation itself happened in a vacuum of expectation. When a creator is constantly aware of the audience, when they are constantly seeking the validation of likes, shares, and positive reviews, they fall into what researchers call validation-seeking culture. They prioritize content that is likely to garner immediate attention over genuine artistic expression. This leads to a marketplace of imitation rather than originality. The fast-paced, ravenous nature of the digital audience encourages shallow engagement. The creator stops painting masterpieces and starts painting whatever the gallery owner tells them sells fastest.
Look, I'm not denying that validation seeking can be a dangerous trap. The literature on how social media undermines creativity is very clear about the dangers of the comparison trap and the fear of missing out. But the solution to the comparison trap isn't total obscurity. It's discipline, it's intentionality. The researchers advocate for mindful consumption, for setting strict boundaries around your creative time, and for aggressively curating your digital feed. They do not advocate for running away to the woods.
But sometimes running to the woods is the only way to reset the baseline.
Temporarily, perhaps. But the public sphere offers unprecedented opportunities for cross-pollination that simply cannot be replicated in isolation. Think of the cultural incubators that emerge online, where users co-create narratives, open-source software, and even memes that shaped broader internet culture. You cannot get that collective creativity, that merging of wildly diverse perspectives if everyone is hiding in their own private silos. Exposure to friction and opposing viewpoints is what inspires and broadens a creator's horizons.
I'm not suggesting that creators should become hermits permanently. I'm arguing that the genesis of profound innovation requires a specific neurological state that only obscurity provides. You mentioned the need for discipline and boundaries. That discipline often has to take the form of a complete digital detox or creating strict audience-free zones. Why? Let's look at the neuroscience of boredom. The brain requires the default mode network to activate in order to generate original ideas.
Right, the brain's resting state.
Yes. When you aren't actively processing a task, like when you're staring at a wall, taking a walk, or experiencing genuine boredom, the brain shifts into the default mode network. Think of it as your brain's background defragmentation process. It starts connecting totally unrelated concepts and memories. That is where lateral thinking happens. But the constant influx of notifications, the pressure of the audience, and the dopamine loop of the public square keeps the brain in a state of high-alert executive functioning.
So it blocks the lateral thinking.
Completely. It actively suppresses the default mode network, preventing the spontaneous reorganization of thought that leads to true inspiration. We have to be willing to disappear for a while, to forget about the audience entirely, so that our brains can do the background work required to actually have something original to say when we return.
You know, I can fully agree that a quiet period of incubation has immense neurological and psychological value. The preparation and incubation stages of the creative process do absolutely require a degree of isolation. But I maintain that this isolation is merely the prelude. The ultimate test of any creative endeavor, the phase where it transitions from a personal journal entry into a transformative innovation, demands the pressure and accountability of an engaged audience.
But does it have to be a massive public audience or just a few trusted peers?
It has to be an audience large enough to introduce real friction. You have to bring the idea to the market, to the gallery, or to the public forum. You have to risk the permanent digital tattoo of failure. As the case studies remind us, the most resilient creative outputs might begin in the shadows, but they are forged into their final shape by public scrutiny. If you never face the crowd, you never actually know if your idea was brilliant or if you were just echoing your own biases in an empty, comfortable room.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, I'll summarize my position by returning to the psychological necessity of those shadows. The stealth mode of obscurity is not a sign of weakness, nor is it merely hiding from criticism. It provides the crucial psychological safety needed to find one's true, authentic voice. By untethering ourselves from the algorithmic memory of past mistakes and the digital gravity of audience expectation, we reclaim our autonomy. We allow our brains the vital boredom and default mode activation required for deep, associative thought, ensuring that when we do finally step into the light, our work is genuinely our own.
And I will summarize by stating that while I deeply respect the sanctuary of that quiet period, the ultimate crucible of innovation is visibility. The noise, the friction, and the demand for clarity provided by a public audience are not just obstacles to be managed, they are the very mechanisms of refinement. The collaboration, the real-time feedback loop, and the accountability of the public sphere are what transform a fragile, private hypothesis into a robust reality. True grit is built not by hiding from the possibility of a permanent digital record, but by risking it openly.
I think where we fundamentally converge is on the understanding that navigating the modern digital landscape cannot be a passive exercise. We are operating in an unprecedented environment of constant visibility. Surviving it requires a highly intentional approach to managing our creative environments, knowing exactly when we need to seek the spotlight for its refining heat, and when we must fiercely protect our right to retreat into the shadows to heal, experiment, and activate that default mode network.
Absolutely. It is a constant, deliberate balancing act between the raw vulnerability of exposure and the developmental safety of isolation.
So, the next time you find yourself working on something new, ask yourself, are you painting in that brightly lit global gallery with everyone watching your every move? Or are you giving yourself the grace to make a mess in the dark? We'll leave it to you to decide which room yields the masterpiece.